Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Right here in the studio with us to speak on unlocking dead assets and real sector growth in Nigeria is Andrew Nevin, Advisory Partner and Chief Economist at PwC Nigeria. Welcome to the morning show, sir. Good morning.
Good morning. Great to be here.
So do you want to...
Yes, sure. I have been following your work for many months now. And one of the things that struck me, and which is why I said we had to have him on the show today, was your passion for Nigeria, your passion for young people, and really your passion on how we steer the Nigerian economy back to a place of growth, because we have had a sluggish economy. We now know that it's all hands on deck. But what do all hands on deck need to be doing? I think that's where there's a lot of confusion, and that's where there's a lot of different people doing different things, and how do we bring all those things together? So I was really excited when you agreed to come in on our weekend show, because I know you've been to see our colleagues during the week, but on the weekend it's always harder to get people here. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much.
I want to start off with a couple of things that we were talking about, especially when you look at the CBN governor's comments, which is that the reliance on crude oil. You have said many times that actually we're not an oil economy, we're a remittance economy, we're a people economy. Tell people what that means and how we can start to unlock that into real growth.
Well, from the government's perspective, of course, most of their revenue still comes from oil. But what happens at the beyond the government people, of course, is the remittances. Just to put some numbers on it, so the official remittances into Nigeria are $25 billion US dollars. The amount of money transferred in 2018 from NNPC to the Federation account was a little over $10 billion. So 2.5 times come into remittances. And we import approximately about $40 billion worth of goods and services, visible imports into Nigeria. So, in fact, what's carrying the bulk of it is actually the diaspora that are remittant. And, of course, we all know people, particularly young professionals, who are leaving the country, and then they're remitting back. And, of course, we also have a large number of students. Now, of course, that's a cost to us because that requires foreign exchange. But many of them will probably end up also working. And when they start working in the UK or Canada, they'll remit. And that remittance number has been going up fast. But the reason I think that the central bank or the federal government doesn't talk about this, or at least hasn't much, is because from their viewpoint, all they see is the oil money. The remittances are spread over millions of Nigerians. And over 75% of the remittances are for consumption. So money sent back, or health care, basic feeding, school fees, et cetera. So it doesn't really touch the government. So in one sense, you have these two foreign exchange regimes going on. The one that touches millions of people, which is connected to the diaspora. The other one that's an oil, the $10 billion. But of course, that oil money doesn't really touch the average Nigerian at the end of the day.
So if you've identified this one blind spot, then how many others are there? Can you actually just take us through it? Because your report, the PwC report, is called Bringing Dead Capital to Life, What Nigeria Should Do. So what should we do? Because the rate of borrowing right now is astronomical. I mean, the president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, said that we're spending 50% of our revenues to service debts.
Right. So when you hear that number, it's alarming, and it is alarming. I think what's critical for people to understand, again, is we collect very little tax revenue, 6 or 7%. And the government actually is very small in Nigeria. It doesn't really touch, again, the average person. So if I take the total spending at all levels of government in Nigeria, it's only 70,000 naira per Nigerian. So that's supposed to be for security, healthcare, education, infrastructure, support for the power sector. But the truth is, and of that 70,000 naira, 10,000 goes to interest. So that's 60,000 naira per person. It's not enough. So what ends up happening is we spend a lot on governance, and that $10 billion and other tax revenue gets absorbed in the governance. What actually impacts people is very, very small on that. So I think in terms of the deficit, I mean, our view is very clear. And obviously, the federal government has, or states as well, have pressure to raise taxes. I want to see them try to tax the bottom of the pyramid or the informal sector, because that's just going to make it more expensive for them to come into the formal sector. We would like to see them begin with focusing on high earners, people that are at the top of the Nigerian economic society and who are not paying their taxes. That's where they have to start. But if we're going to have broad-based increase in tax collection, we need to have a situation where the government, the state sector, is relevant to people. People are not going to come. I mean, we have somewhere between 50 and 65% of the Nigerian economy is informal. Now, why is it informal? Well, it's informal because it's more expensive. People don't want to come into the formal sector. We often talk about financial services, right, and financial inclusion. The CBN has a program for that. But no one, it's not like people who are economically active don't have financial services. There's actually a lot of informal financial services, lending circles, just in a marketplace where someone holds your money. They may deal with the bank or not, but the individual trader doesn't necessarily have a bank account. So now you say you want to bring them into the formal system. No one will come into the formal system. You can't force them, or shouldn't force them, unless they make it more attractive. Now, why do people not want to come into the formal system? They don't because it's too expensive. Too many permits, too many regulatory costs, et cetera. So then you make that choice. And I think we would really like to see the government start to think about that. Like, if you make it less attractive to come to the formal sector, we'll continue on the path that we're on. But in terms of the dead capital issue, so we've spoken for years about the need for foreign investment, portfolio and direct, and that's fine. But the truth is, it's not ideal. You don't want to tap into foreign sources for capital because you have to pay it back until you use all your own capital. So what's our biggest source of capital? The biggest source of capital anywhere in the world is real estate. So 2/3 of all the world's assets are real estate. But our real estate market doesn't function very well, again, because of the complexities around permitting, perfection, who has the title, et cetera. So we wrote the paper to say, look, the number one thing that would improve our economy, drive growth, hopefully in an inclusive way, is to unlock the real estate sector. I mean, if you go back to, people talk about, I'm Canadian, in Canada's 50s and 60s, we had a very rapidly growing economy. What drove that was residential real estate. So you had the post-war baby boom, people built houses. My own family, we were immigrants, and when I was 5, we bought a house, 800 square feet, one floor, very simple, 95% mortgage. But of course, that drives, when you talk about unemployment here, that's what drives employment, I'm sorry. So carpenters, plumbers, electricians. When you're building a house for the masses, you're not importing building materials. It has to be local building materials. When someone buys a house, you end up furnishing it over time. You can't do everything at once. So we're really focused on that. We want other industries to develop, but if the other industries develop and real estate doesn't, we still are going to have a big growth problem, a big employment problem.
I mean, in that report, you guys said $300 billion, even all the way up to $900 billion, which is a huge amount of money to be stuck and not inflow in the economy. When you look at sort of how do you marry some of the investments, the diaspora, because some of that investment is also coming from the diaspora into the real estate, and that real estate is actually not being utilized. How exactly can we start to unlock that opportunity in real estate, from mortgages all the way down to actually the perfecting some of the documents that actually is preventing that, and how can technology help?
Well, I think that this is an issue, land is an issue that's both at the federal government and at the state level. And we're not advocating, there are obviously lands in this country that are communal in the sense of traditional lands, and we're not advocating privatizing that. But there is certainly urban land, and even rural land where it's just more and more productive because of agriculture. We need to know at the end of the day who owns the land, because no one's going to invest in the land unless ownership is clear. There's not going to be a mortgage unless ownership is clear. You can't really develop real estate unless there's a mortgage system. How many people can buy a house for cash? In fact, if we're really honest, people in Nigeria buying a house for cash, often that's dark money that they're using for it. And that's part of the problem with the real estate sector, is if you've used dark money to buy real estate, you don't really want to draw attention to yourself. And so that becomes a stuck asset. There are even in Victoria Island and Ikoyi, which is probably the most expensive real estate in Africa, there's a lot of empty buildings because the people that own the buildings don't necessarily feel the need to get an income. So we need to unlock all that. Obviously, at the federal government level, there needs to be some reform of the Land Use Act. At the state level, you need a much more streamlined system and a guarantee that you don't necessarily need the governor's assent. If you own the land and it's perfected, you can transfer it to someone else. And then in terms of technology, I mean, obviously countries have developed land use systems on paper. The UK developed on paper, very effective. But we might as well leapfrog to the next technology, which of course is for land use is blockchain or distributed ledger. And basically, so everyone has a common view of all the records. You know who owns the land, you know who's mortgaged the land, you know that mortgage payments are up to date. You have the valuer, the valuation surveys.
We're going to ask you to hold that thought while we go on break. When we come back, I want to just also ask you, who do you believe has done this very well in Africa, and who can we learn from? We'll take a break now. When we come back, we'll come back to have more conversation with Dr. Nevin, the Economist. Welcome back to the morning show. We're still in studio with Nevin, advisory partner and chief economist at PwC Nigeria. Before we went on break, we were talking about the land use and use of technology, and really how do we start to unlock the value in real estate? This is not a Nigeria-only problem. This is a problem across Africa because of just the way land ownership has evolved. What places are doing a good job on the continent, and what can we learn from them?
Well, I know sometimes Nigerians don't want to hear this, but the sub-Saharan African country that's most advanced in this, of course, is Rwanda.
Yeah.
And sometimes people have kind of Rwanda envy. All they hear about is Rwanda, right? I mean, but the reality is, it is if you think, you know, it's a miracle, right? So
yes.
in terms of ease of doing business, they're now 29th in the world. Mm-hmm. Now, the #1 African country is Mauritius. It's a bit different as a financial center, but in terms of countries on the continent on an island. They're 29th. That's ahead of France, ahead of Germany, ahead of the Netherlands. I mean, it's an extraordinary story. They banned plastic bags. I mean, people want to be there. They're investing, and of course, they benefit from the East African community. But on the land use issue, they started a decade ago, more than 2008, I believe, where they just said, and they weren't using blockchain, but they were digitizing. They said, look, we need a digital record of who owns every bit of land in the country. And they've now, I think, completed that. And you can transfer, one of the reasons they're 29th is because you can actually transfer land. We know who owns the land. They're able to have a mortgage system on that. So, and you might say, well, we don't have 10 years. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have any choice, right? I mean, if we have to start,
sure.
right? And Lagos has made a lot of effort in the last few years to digitize, but it's a massive job. But we'd like to see every governor sort of step up and say, look, we want real estate to work. We have a housing deficit of 17 million units. We don't believe, I mean, obviously the federal government has a role, but to be honest, that's going to be solved at a state level. I mean, real estate's a very local kind of activity on that. Local builders, local materials, local conditions. The governors need to understand how critical real estate is to absorb employment. And the other implication of all this is, in terms of our educational policy, people have talked about it, but we would like to see even more emphasis on vocational education. Sometimes when you have the elites debate, they're all thinking about university, and obviously tertiary education is critical, but we need tradespeople, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's fantastic employment.
So you have addressed this question in different ways, but I have to ask you, the president said last month that his plan is to lift 100 million Nigerians out of poverty in 10 years. How feasible is that, and what needs to happen to achieve it?
Well, let me start out by saying, I mean, I've been here more than a decade. And when I came a decade ago, it was the financial crisis. We came out of that, and then we had very rapid growth, but it was a little bit of false growth, right? It only benefited the top of Nigerian society, and we consumed everything. I think we were the largest consumers in Nigeria of champagne, totally unprepared for the oil crash. So then we came down and we've had growth below GDP, below population growth. So we've got poorer and poorer. I think the difference now is, I mean, when the presidency came out and said this, he'd never really acknowledged it before, right? I mean, when Brookings came out and said we had the highest numbers in absolute poverty, it was not, the response of the federal government was to deny it a little bit. And so I think we actually have moved a long way ahead in the sense that central bank is saying we need 10% growth. I mean, the governor was very clear. He's accomplished, or the central bank under his leadership have accomplished many things, stabilizing the exchange rate and the stability, and not just FX, but the banking system. But now they both acknowledged at the CBN at the federal government level that we actually have to grow faster. So I think that's a big change and positive. But what we've said for maybe a year, 18 months is, okay, so we get that, but what we then need is some structural changes, significant structural changes. And we're yet to see kind of that debate. So we have, I mean, there are many, but we usually put 5 out there to begin with, which is the fuel subsidy. And of course, in a way, that's the easiest structural change to make. The others have more complicated, but it's maybe the hardest politically. But at least the difference now between now and, say, a year ago is it's out there. People understand. I mean, the Emir of Canada is talking about it. We're talking about it. Many eminent economists are talking about it, just asking the question, how is it possible to spend ₦1 trillion in this country on a fuel subsidy that benefits mainly the wealthy and other countries, because we then export fuel, subsidized fuel to our neighbors, and yet we don't spend that much on public health care. So that's the kind of beginning of structural change. But we're still waiting for that structural change to unlock the growth. But you ask, is it feasible? I mean, I went to China the first time in 1983. I lived there for 10 years. I watched, it was a very tiny part of 600 million people, 700 million people lifted out of poverty. India, as you know, I'm very connected to India. You've watched, their growth was a little later, but there used to be something called the Hindu rate of growth, 2 or 3%. Maybe that's the Nigerian rate of growth. And then they unlocked it. And one of the things they unlocked it with, of course, was outsourcing, right? So the IT sector. And what's interesting about that is we complain a lot about our port infrastructure. So to manufacture something and ship it through the ports and be competitive in the world is probably not that easy in the short term. But you can. We talked about exporting people. We can export our people while our people still live here. And there's an incredible company in this country called Outsource Global, run by Amal Hassan, very famous entrepreneur. I mean, who's created this in the north.
Yeah, she's doing an amazing
job. She's got
job.
1,000 seats so far. Well, if both her company and others doing the same thing, we could have tens of thousands of seats or hundreds of thousands of seats, and then we're starting to make a significant impact. So in terms of exports, we should focus on everything, but I really like trying to duplicate the Indian model. There's millions of seats in India. It's getting more expensive in India. How many of them can we move to Nigeria, particularly to northern Nigeria, which would make a huge difference?
You mentioned this briefly, which is still tied into this, which is technical and vocational education. There's not enough of a conversation had around it, and also actually certification from a regulatory perspective is very difficult to actually get those type of institutions. How can we start to unlock that opportunity? Because that really goes into almost some of the debt capital you're talking about as well, because we really don't have enough people that actually work in this sector, in the vocational, and we don't have a robust apprenticeship program. I once heard that people were bringing in masons from Ghana to come and build homes here. So how do we unlock that part? Because we have a young population that there are not enough seats in institutions for them. How do we start to build a technical and vocational?
Well, I think that in this area, we really should probably borrow the model from Brazil. So Brazil has a very advanced technical education, and what they do which is critical, is it's very modular. So you can't take a young person and say you're going to have to do 3 years studying to be a mason. What you do is you give a 3 or 4 month course. You have a foundational. They can then work at a site for a while for building. If they want to get more advanced as a mason or as a particularly electrician, I mean, there's many levels of it. So that program, and I believe Lagos State has gone and visited Brazil and looked at it. So I think there's interest in it. We'll see with the new governor. I mean, I think he recognizes the criticality of the real estate industry on that. So, but just dropping in something like that, let's not reinvent the wheel on that. I mean, physics and building materials, and I mean, Brazil are very similar to the conditions that we have here. So let's steal from the Brazilians. And in fact, in many ways, if you look at the countries we should be looking to just to take their ideas and then adapt them, Brazil and India are probably the 2 top places that are most similar to Nigerians' needs.
Why is it then that Nigerians are obsessed with sort of the Singapore models and also the U.S. models? Every time people sort of look at models, they sort of go into, I mean, I have a friend who lives in Singapore, and she said there is not a time where there is not a Nigerian governor or head of department that is not in Singapore doing a visit. Why is it that we don't tend to gravitate towards the Indias and the Brazils of the world?
Well, I think it's a mistake to look at Singapore. Every time I hear someone say, let's use Singapore as a proxy, I mean, it's a city-state, it's only 5 million people. It was run under a highly autocratic leader, and we could have a debate about, I mean, obviously in material terms, Singapore has done very well. I think most Singaporeans, when I've been there, are happy with it, but it's certainly not a model for us. Complexity, complex society, big country. I mean, I was with someone from the government at an event last week, and she was saying, yeah, I mean, we can learn from Rwanda, but we still have to recognize we're 200 million people. But I think one of the implications for us, and we would like to keep using this term as we talk about it, is simplicity. I mean, really what hampers a lot of our economic development here is complexity. You know, we have too many regulations, we have overlapping jurisdictions. So I think, I may have the numbers wrong, but PEBEC, of course, is really, and they've done a fantastic job. They've focused on the single window, right? So a company can deal with, but the single window, if I understand that when they talk about it, is to deal with 29 ministries, departments, or agencies. And then the question you ask yourself is, why do you have to deal with 29 ministries, departments, and agencies?
That's a great question.
So again, it's we've put in PEBEC, and it has done a fantastic job under Dr. Chimoke, but it doesn't address the structural issues that sort of says, well, actually, maybe we don't need 29 agencies, maybe we need 14 or 8
So there's still a lot of whittling down that needs to be done.
Right, and there was a commission. I mean, 2014, there was a study done on this, and President Jonathan came out recently, actually, and said, look, people sort of say we didn't implement it, but I mean, the reality was we did the study in 2014, and we had an election in 2015, so there was for something so critical, there was no time, and that part of the agenda has not got picked up. And if you read the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, which of course I have to read every page, but again, each individual item makes sense in isolation, but when you add it all up, it doesn't address this complexity issue. So one of the things that we really are talking about is, the subnational level. State governors actually have to get on with what they need to do in their state, and we'd like to see the federal government give more powers, and that may require some constitutional changes. But independently of that structural change, governors have no choice. They should get on with it. And one of the things that we've seen is, I mean, I think some governors are really very focused. Obviously, Governor Obaseki in Edo State is an example on that. Lagos State is where it is because of a succession of governors who've been very focused. Ogun State developed very well. One of the interesting things about Ogun State is that it has the highest IGR to GDP, over 3%. So they're really starting to, and of course that's an indication that they're serving the population well because they're prepared to pay taxes. But the state that's number one in ease of doing business at the state level is actually Kaduna on that.
Wow,
so again,
yes.
so there's another example. So I think one of the things that we would really like to push as PwC in the next number of months is subnational activity and support the state governors at that. And I'd like to tie it to the diaspora issue because, of course...
Okay, we're going to come back to the diaspora issue when we come back from a quick break. Thank you so much. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise. If you're just joining us, we're still with Andrew Nevin, Advisory Partner and Chief Economist at PwC Nigeria. Andrew, before we went on break, you were tying some of these loose ends together, especially with the diaspora. I'll let you pick up on that.
Well, I think with the diaspora, now is the recognition that how critical it is to us. I mean, both supporting us now, but also can we do more? So we've never really had much of a strategy. But of course, recently the federal government sort of upgraded. So Mrs. DeBerry moved from being special advisor to now heading I think the National Diaspora Commission. And I know she's starting to put together plans which are very critical. But I think one of the things about the diaspora that we want to put out there is, actually, the diaspora is not necessarily connected so much to Nigeria. They're often connected to their state or their region. So what we're starting to do is encourage the states to have their own diaspora strategy. And if you because it's much more sort of visceral for people, right? So if the federal government's connecting to you, okay, may not. And again, India is a very good model. So India has a fantastic engagement with this diaspora, including, for example, they have something called non-resident Indian, which are people of Indian descent who basically can travel in and out freely. They're recognized as Indians. They could have been born abroad, but they have the lineage, the heritage. Of course, many of our diaspora didn't necessarily leave Nigeria. They might have been born abroad, but they're still of Nigerian heritage. You know, their parents have kept them some connectivity to it on that. But what we would like to see is each state take some responsibility, take responsibility to engage with its own diaspora. So in the modern world, that means, you know, creating a digital presence, being able to connect to them. And the state can connect, and this is what the Indian states do, right? So they connect at the national level, but also at the subnational level.
So interesting.
And then what you have, so then what you can do as a state is you can say, look, there are things that, you know, you're sending money to your own family, there's CSR projects, you know, then you have to have some proper monitoring. I mean, one of the biggest things the diasporans want to know is if they contribute to a CSR or more of a charitable thing, who's monitoring it? So they have to create those structures. And then if they can package up investments, again, that are monitored. I mean, one of the biggest things I said before, 75% of the diaspora remittances go for current consumption, medical care. But people want to invest. You know, that 25% is going for real estate, housing. Many of the diaspora want to invest, but what they want are products created for them that are that they trust effectively. So who's going to package up real estate projects? What's the monitoring and technology that's available so they know that those are, you know, how do they get their return? So I think there's going to have to be a lot of innovation in this area. And also, of course, you know, part of it's also payment innovation. So you're sitting, I mean, a lot of our remittances are actually coming in the informal system. But if we're going to try to bring them into the formal system, we have to have easier ways to move money. And of course, you know, Libra came out, which has a connection to some of these things. And I mean, the cost of using the basic banking or Western Union remittance system are far too high, right? So there's so all of these things combined together. But the message we want to give this morning is we really would like to see the governors and the states start to think about their diaspora. And maybe what could happen is we create a common, like every state for its digital platform, let's not each state create its own digital platform, create one digital platform that's duplicated. So you can do it at the highest quality, and then it's duplicated for each state and managed by each state. So that's one idea to put out there.
Absolutely, I love that idea. But still on Nigeria, this sort of novel perspective that you're introducing of Nigeria as an exporter of people rather than oil, which is what we're used to. But obviously that has changed, and our government's narrative hasn't caught up with that quite yet. But there's a problem, and I hate to say it, is the country of origin effect. Nigeria's reputation is pretty poor. So how do we surmount that to really leverage on our potential as an exporter of people? Right.
So, I mean, we haven't put the brand issue on the agenda until recently, and the reason for it, to be really blunt about it, is we don't know the answer. So, you know, normally if we put, as PwC, we put something out, we have at least a suggestion, and like on this engage in the diaspora, et cetera, or dead capital. The brand issue we've been talking about internally for a long time, but we don't have the answer. But, you know, let's put it on the agenda. I guess what we need to do is study other countries that have gone through a similar transition. But one of the interesting things is the diaspora is probably the only thing that's helping our brand, because, you know, people might have a negative perception of Nigeria, but when they work with a professional Nigerian in their work life, you know, that's the only thing that's giving a positive impression on it. So I'm not sure of the answer, but let's put it on the agenda. I think the federal government needs to step up and admit it needs to work on you know, how do we tell the narrative? How do we communicate to people? But obviously one simple thing is we need a better airport in Lagos. I mean, it's really, so I met with a gentleman yesterday who came from Egypt, just introduced through someone else, and I just said I would meet him, and his first time to Nigeria, and he's very positive. He's coming here to do business, and you know, I'm excited because, you know, I want to have intra-Africa commercial relationships. So he's come from Egypt, made the effort, and he didn't complain. But I just know you land at that airport, not the one in Abuja, it's nice, but the one in Lagos. It's a tough situation. And of course, it's improved a lot, but it's still compared to, I mean, you go to Lomé and you look at the airport. You go to the new airport in Nairobi.
And I mean, Addis is just, I mean, the first time I flew into Addis, I was blown away.
Yeah, so that's one simple thing. But I think the brand issue we're putting on the agenda, even though we don't have much of a solution right now.
I mean, I think one of the things that the government has done in the past, they have done a brand Nigeria project. It was haphazard. And I think that's why sort of everyone was also turned off by it, because in a way, there was no strategy behind it. And it is a tough one to tackle. Going back to some of the people stuff, and especially around subsidies and who benefits from subsidies. I'll give you a simple example. Someone invited me to come to see them in Lekki. I normally try to avoid Lekki most of the during the week, during certain parts of the day. But I looked at Google, there was no traffic, so I get there and I said, they were like, school's out. So people that are moving children around for school are not on the road. And so I kept on thinking that, so that had this big of an effect, which means that the people that are moving kids around have enough money to afford for kids to be in all these different cars. And so, but when we talk about subsidy removal, especially around oil, which Nigeria has a lot of different subsidies, which people feel that is the only benefit they get from the state. Because when you think about the fact that per head, Nigeria only spends 60,000 naira on people. When you're talking to the taxi driver, he doesn't understand. And this to him, it feels like the only clear access that he gets from the government, the only clear service he gets from the government. How do we start to change that narrative for people, especially when we bring up the issue of subsidy?
Well, I understand why the taxi driver would say that, because he's not getting education, he's not getting health care, he's not getting infrastructure, he's not getting security, supplying all of those to himself. I guess if you think about, again, some other countries, one basic issue with subsidies in Nigeria is I don't think you can imagine some countries can subsidize an activity and you get more of it and it works and it's not subverted. But I'm not sure that is happening in modern Nigeria. Anything we subsidize we're not going to get the intended outcome to be, whether it's power, whether it's the fuel subsidy, any other activity, right? We're suspicious, or we've been a little bit negative of some of these intervention programs, because anytime you lend money to some people at 25 and other people at 9%, it just creates distortions and doesn't get at the root of the problem on that. So, I think if we were in a different world, I know this is not feasible, but actually we would be better off if we wanted to subsidize people, providing that subsidy and just sending it directly to all Nigerians, but in a particular way, in a way that we create a much more of electronic money. Like if you wanted to encourage electronic money and mobile wallets, et cetera, really, let's take that sort of subsidy if we want, and we want to help the bottom of the pyramid, we're better off, and there are other countries who've done it, just send them unconditional, their share of the oil revenue, and then everyone's now got an electronic wallet, and we have much more efficient payments, but I don't think that's a realistic
I don't think. I think there are too many people that
Well,
want to be on
why
in the gray areas.
They don't want to come out of the shadows.
I don't think
but
so.
You made a reference to this earlier, but it comes back to this again with your point about the subsidy. Really, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? The government needs to create some kind of environment to encourage people to let go of their attachment to subsidy, let go of their tax naira that they're hoarding. So at what point do you think that we're buoyant enough to be able to introduce some of these measures? Because I'm reading about tax base increasing to 45 million and consolidated tax database, and all of that sounds very well and good, but how feasible really is that?
Well, I think that, I think the challenge for the government is not actually raising more tax revenue right now. We talk about that, and the 60% of tax revenue goes to interest, all of those things. The challenge for me, for the government, is to be relevant. Once they're relevant to people, they're going to be able to make all these other moves. But I think to try to raise more tax revenue while you're not relevant is going to end in failure.
While we're our own government,
Right.
we provide all these services.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, one of the terms we've been using in maybe the last 6 months is Nigerians are self-organizing people. So you think about what's happened, right? So the resources provided by the state, as I said, are only 60,000 naira per person. It's about between 8 and 9%, right? Which is much smaller than any other. And of course, a lot of it is absorbed in governance. We know how expensive the Senate is.
Yep.
The reps are. We know how expensive. Why we have so many MDAs? Because every time you subdivide an MDA, the managing director gets his perks, et cetera, and those costs all add up. So really, not 60,000 is not even getting to the. It's a much smaller amount. So then people go around and say, well, the state, the public sector, is not relevant to me. In fact, it's a negative. You don't want to be stopped by a policeman, right?
Sure.
So in that Nigerians are very resourceful. They've just gone and organized themselves, either at an individual level or in different sorts of collectives that stand outside of the public sector. And one of the,
Andrew, it's been really such a great pleasure to have you on the show, and we really enjoyed talking to you. I mean, I think for us, we'll definitely love to have you back to unpack even some more of the things we've just uncovered, especially the real role of the diaspora and how the diaspora can contribute to what's happening locally and the innovation that can happen around that. I wanted to talk to you also about blockchain, but it looks like we're going to have to save that.
We'll wait for another day.
We're going to have to save that for another day. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
being here.